So hi everyone. Oh, sorry. Welcome. Okay. Anyway, my name is Maryanne Magnier, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work I'm currently doing as an investigator at a pro bono defense clinic in DC. And if you have any questions or any comments throughout the presentation, please jump in, anything you disagree with, want to talk about, so we can make it more of a conversation. And this isn't empirical research, this is what I've witnessed out in the field. Sorry, okay. All right. So right now I'm an investigator at Georgetown Law's Criminal Justice Clinic, and it's a pro bono clinic at the law school. I'm not a current student at the law school, I just graduated from undergrad, but I'm an investigator at the clinic. And what the clinic does is provides free defense and legal assistance to indigent clients, which means people who cannot otherwise afford counsel. And there are 17 clinics at the law school, and they're a way for students at the law school to get to get hands-on experience with the law, but it's also really great because, like I said, they provide free representation for people in the community. And what I do at the clinic is I'm working right now for 2 different defense attorneys, and I do investigations for them, which is anything they need: writing and serving subpoenas, taking witness statements, going out and talking to people, figuring out what happened, watching body cam footage, and that kind of thing. And I want to make clear I'm not a representative of the law school or the clinic, and what I am saying is my own opinions and what I've seen out in the field. So one thing I've noticed as an investigator is how the police are using outdated methods or methods which studies and academics have shown are not super reliable. For example, there's a lot of academic research about identification of suspects and the right and wrong way to properly identify suspects. And one example is show-up identification. Say I was mugged on the street, and then the police drove me down the street where they had found someone, and they said, "Was this the person who mugged you?" And that's actually not reliable, because the bias is that if you see that the police have found someone, you're more likely to assume, well, they have a reason that they held them, they have a reason that this is probably the right person, but you're not really supposed to be influenced by any thinking. You're supposed to be shown a lineup of different people. But when I watch body cam footage and when I work on these cases, you see that being used all the time. And it's the same with other types of identification strategies or just other methods where you see the actual policing lagging behind academic research. Okay. And then another huge thing I've noticed is how over-policing in DC and nationwide has really contributed to the racial disparities of arrests. Washington, D.C. is consistently the most, or one of the most, heavily policed cities in the whole country in terms of officers per capita. And most of the cases we get are directly because of this. And most of the cases we get are from people just being watched all the time. And people of color in DC are far more likely to live in low-income neighborhoods which are constantly surveilled by the police, and they're constantly watched. It's not just, oh, someone stole something from my house, the police investigate, they find someone. It's the police are just driving around, roaming the street, and then they might see an argument between two homeless people. And they're like, oh, this is disorderly conduct, or this is a simple assault, and then they arrest them on site. And so the vast majority of our cases probably wouldn't have gone noticed if the people just lived in a different area where the police were less frequently patrolling. Okay. And then another major problem leading to racial disparities in the justice system. Just a little background, in DC, 8 to 9 out of 10 arrests are Black people in DC, which is disproportionate to the population and not at all a reflection of who actually commits crimes. There are just a lot of reasons for this disparity. An example is over-policing, like I mentioned before. And then additionally, you see different communities in different neighborhoods just treated differently on the street, because the police and the prosecution have huge flexibility in who they charge and what they charge people with. And you see that you see anytime someone has individual power or leeway, you see bias influencing the outcomes. And I've seen this all the time, going to arraignments, maybe like a white woman got into a fight, they charge it as simple assault, and then they decide she's not a threat and they release her. And then none of our clients, which are typically Black men, they always decide to lock them up and they decide to keep them in jail. It's not empirical research, but the examples I've witnessed are shown in data that police and prosecutors are a lot more likely to put heavier charges and other charges on Black people in DC. There's a lot of problems with racism and the MPD, etc. And another example is one of our cases was a man who went to McDonald's and he filled up, he got a cup of water and then he filled it with soda and they called the police. Meanwhile, I've had friends do that exact same thing and then they just ask them to pay for it. Okay. So another thing commonly seen is police or prosecutors overcharging people, and they'll try to tack on every offense they can, even if it's not super necessary. And the reason is they want, they want to show more arrests, but also it's to give them leverage when they try to get plea bargains later. Because right now in this country, 97% of cases go to plea bargains. They never go to trial at all, which is not great because of our constitutional right to trial by jury. But what prosecutors do, I don't know, do any of you listen to Serial, the podcast Serial? Our favorite podcast. So I was just listening to an episode and they were talking about how a woman was basically assaulted at a bar. And then she was defending herself. A lot of people were fighting. She was slapping around. And an officer ended up getting in the middle of it and she accidentally hit him in the face. And she had no idea that the officer was there. But they charged her with felony assault. They charged her with all sorts of things. And then finally, when the case went to a plea, they said, okay, we'll drop everything if you just plead to disorderly conduct. And then that looks great because she was risking being charged with so many different things, but you don't want any charge, and sometimes you shouldn't even be charged at all. And her defense attorney was this isn't even a win because she didn't do anything wrong. She was just defending herself, and then she was the only person charged. But it creates an environment where people feel very tempted to plead guilty to things that they didn't do or that they should not even have been charged with in the first place. But then sometimes the police have sneaky little tricks to know what will be more sympathetic to a jury and what will be more sympathetic to a judge. For example, assault on a police officer is a felony, which means that people are entitled to a jury. But a lot of times police might charge it as simple assault because simple assault means you're not entitled to a jury. And the police know that juries are more likely to side with victims of the police, where the judge is more likely to be on the side of the police. So they have all sorts of little tricks to get around these things.
Just to be clear, there is an APO misdemeanor charge in DC, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
True. So, okay. And then something else I've seen is that criminalization of mental illness is huge. And diagnoses often come too late for a lot of these people in low-income communities in DC. One of our clients, or a handful of the clients on cases I've worked on, they're not diagnosed with a mental illness in school. They're not diagnosed when they're children. The first time they're ever diagnosed and properly treated is after they've been arrested, when they're assigned a caseworker because they've been arrested. and they're already in the prison system. And if they came from a wealthier background, their school had more resources, this likely could have been prevented in the first place. And then additionally, the law enforcement is famously bad at handling like mental health episodes. We've seen like schizophrenic, bipolar episodes be seen as like disorderly conduct. They'll get charged for various things because first responders are not well trained, at least in DC, are not well trained in handling mental illness and mental health crises. Okay. And then another big problem in DC is homelessness and homeless people being susceptible to certain charges just by virtue of being homeless. And DC, this is a huge problem because the national average of homeless people is about 17 per 10,000 people are homeless, and in DC it's closer to 111. And this is made worse by heavy gentrification in DC, and only 58% of students graduate high school. There's a lot of problems with the education system, etc. There's a ton of different factors. But you see law enforcement utilize like what they can do as a tool of social control. And if a business says like, I don't want this homeless person like panhandling in front of my company, then they can't like explicitly arrest someone for being homeless, but they might charge them with loitering, they might charge them with panhandling, different charges which are just inherent in being homeless. And you see that a lot. Like I've had cases which are two like homeless men arguing on the street, and then they charge them with simple assault or they charge them with disorderly conduct, which seems just unnecessary to go through the system. Okay. And one way that DC's discovery law is not good for defense is trial by ambush is what like the attorneys I work for refer to it, and other attorneys refer to it. But basically in DC, the defense isn't entitled to a lot of information at the beginning. When we first get a case, all we see is a very basic police report, and then we have to go out and investigate. And that's why we have investigators at the clinic, and laws vary a lot by state. But we've gone to trial and not been told at all who like the government witnesses are until the day of the trial. And that immediately puts the defense like at a disadvantage because we're coming in with not much information. In the first trial I worked on, like we get to trial, we learn that they had a witness who no one told us about. We learned of other like criminal charges on behalf of the complainants, and then the trial was postponed. And that makes our job harder because when you're up against the government, like as a defense attorney, you have a lot less power, you have a lot less access to the information. The police are on the side of the government inherently, and so it's really difficult. And the trials being longer are, the trials being longer are a big problem, especially for our low-income clients who can't keep missing work and can't keep coming into trial. Because we've had multiple continuances where someone needs to find childcare another day, needs to miss work, and that puts a disproportionate burden on our low-income client, or all our clients are low-income, but on low-income clients. Yeah. And additionally, it always surprised me, like people hate going to court, people hate talking to the defense. Like we'll go investigate cases and no one wants to talk to us, which is difficult because if the police show up at your door, like you're gonna talk to them, but when like a random girl comes and like asks what you saw and says she's on the side of the defense, like people don't really want to talk to you. Okay. Another problem in the system that I haven't seen yet with my cases, and most of my cases are pre-trial, but DC inmates can be sent all over the country. And the DC jurisdiction prison closed a few years ago, so now prisoners are just thrown into the federal system, and they can end up at any of the 1,100 prisons across the country. So you can be charged in DC, you've lived in DC your whole life, and all of a sudden you're in prison in California. And this is really difficult, right? Because it makes it really hard for like family and friends to visit you, and it disproportionately harms like poor clients who can't afford to go fly to California all the time, can't afford to visit their families. And it's an actual problem because multiple studies have shown that social networks when coming out of prison are really important to keep people out of jail. But if you like are estranged from your family, if you can't see your friends, you've been in prison in a whole nother part of the country, then it makes it really difficult when you come out to find work, to have those social ties that are so important, etc. Okay. Oh yeah, what's up?
Does the government also provide any kind of funding for the inmates after they release to go back to DC?
I don't know a ton about release programs. They have some programs, and I think they at least help get back to DC, but it's very minimal for once you're actually out, the resources they have. Yeah. What's
Fewer
up?
prison space for a return, but doesn't provide reinforcement.
But not much else, right? Yeah. Thanks.
So isn't there like a 500-mile kind of maximum that these prisoners can be sent away? Where would we find how often that's not acknowledged? And what does the defense do in those cases when their client is sent away and shouldn't be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Defense doesn't really have a ton of power on where the inmate ends up, and public defenders, like in a certain area, I might not be correct about this, but I would say that they couldn't, like DC defenders would not get any compensation to go and visit someone while they were in prison far away, like after their job is done. Because usually public defenders like work on a trial and then their job is done, and clients get moved between defenders a lot of the time. So I'd say once they're off in a different prison, then their DC public defender wouldn't have resources or access to them. If anyone knows anything differently, like please correct me. Yeah.
And like just to clarify, you're saying that there are no prisons here, but there are jails here, though, right?
There's no prison that's just like that's DC jurisdiction where they're automatically sent. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so that's some of the things I've observed. If anyone has any questions, any thoughts, like please jump in. Yeah.
Okay, well, so you just noted that DC is idiosyncratic and where prisoners go. I don't think you mentioned that it's also idiosyncratic in regards to prosecution. Unique to district, the U.S. attorney, not elected, appointed by the president, is responsible for all felony prosecutions and even serious misdemeanors. Then the DC Attorney General under Home Rule handles the really low-level cases. So it sounds like, I don't know exactly all the cases you worked on. It sounds like most of them would probably be, if they were to go to trial, but in any case during plea bargaining, are handled by the Attorney General, DC, rather than the U.S. Attorney's Office. Is that the case, and have you seen any difference in how they're addressed? There's a wave of newly elected progressive prosecutors across the U.S. in Denver, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and so on, who I think have different perspective on these matters than the U.S. Attorney in D.C. might.
So the question is it the Attorney General prosecuting or versus?
Well, right. So I mean, these, I would imagine two homeless men on the street having an argument. I don't know exactly where the distinction is in DC between which low-level offenses or infractions go to the Home Rule Attorney General for DC and which go to the USA.
Wait, I saw you shaking your head. Do you have a?
Yeah, so the Attorney General's office for DC, which is an elected position, doesn't handle low-level versus felony. They handle all the juvenile crime, traffic, and quality of life crimes. Just sort of and the USAO then will handle basically everything else against adults, whether it's a felony or misdemeanor.
Okay, but the low-level quality of life, it sounds like that's a lot of what...
a simple assault between two adults will be handled by the USAO. A simple assault is a USAO charge.
Again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to this, but my question was, do you think that that by virtue of having USAO handling this, the DC is resistant, whatever the local sentiments may be, to the sorts of prosecutorial reform that we're seeing in a lot of other big cities with similar demographics to the to DC? That obviously matters who's president, but I didn't hear that under Obama, the USAO for DC was particularly progressive.
Yeah, so about like reforms in this matter?
Right, I mean, so a lot you're talking about is the MPD, but the prosecutor's office has a lot to say in how these cases proceed. And just wondering, from perspective, is DC going to be more resistant to prosecutorial reform that we're seeing nationwide because of
It's subject to the federal system?
because of lack of home rule on these charges?
Yeah.
I know you're not a lawyer, so.
I would personally
Don't
say
put the burden on
probably, given like DC's like subject to the federal system and the administration, but that's not a super informed opinion. And if anyone has any thoughts, they can jump in.
I don't think DC as a population, like, who live here, versus, you know, a Trump appointing, the USAO. I also think that we're different, the USAO office here is different because there is a recognition that we're prosecuting local crime here, as opposed to any other USAO.
Are you with them?
I was with OAG.
Oh,
And OAG has always been trying to get back,
I see.
or not get back, get authority over local prosecution. It's hasn't worked. It's unlikely to work. So I think the population doesn't even know. Like, I don't think that people who live here until they get until they get appointed on a jury know that there's this sort of demarcation between who's prosecuting. But I do think, in addition to us prosecuting local crime, we are in a bubble. That like the current one we have was the interim during the transition, and she was, you know, she prosecuted, and so isn't as political as an appointment as other USAOs because they are prosecuting only federal crime. So we still are in a bubble, I think, as far as prosecuting.
Thanks.
But for the local, so you're saying the local is it's the Attorney General? No, you said it's U.S.
I'm saying local as far as
for
crime.
okay.
Whereas, you know, any other state, any other jurisdiction is going to be their DA, their state's attorney, and not the USAO, any other jurisdiction is doing the federal
But your
crime.
former office wants to grab that back, and it's been years.
Grab it at all.
Yeah, and it hasn't.
We've never
happened.
had it.
Yeah. So
Except
are
for-
there more, are there less diversion programs or less alternatives to incarceration programs because of the current climate and the fact that the U.S. Attorney's Office is typically pressing those cases?
I think there are probably less than other DAs or state's attorneys for the same sort of office. So, yes, I
Yeah,
think
it did seem like I
fewer.
was involved a little bit with reentry programs
Oh,
at the tail end of the Obama administration, and there were all these great meetings and wonderful ideas and percolating about how to really change the reentry process, and meetings at the Department of Justice involving a huge roundtable of folks, and then it just disappeared, went away, and there seems to be very little being done on the reentry front, sadly. So, under the current administration. So, and it's such a profound need, obviously, we all know that.
Right. I mean, I will differ with our speaker a bit, and I think that DC is liberal in its population, and in its judges, and in its juries. So the representation from our speaker and I will respectfully differ, that juries and judges in DC side with victims is not in my experience. So I think you do have, as opposed to other jurisdictions, you do have, I think, judges doing pretrial release for even those charged with felonies. I think that victims aren't always given the consideration that defendants in DC have. So as far as giving shots for pretrial release, I think we see that in DC a lot. Juries acquitting versus convicting. I think our numbers would bear out differently than other jurisdictions.
I think like a lot of it has to do with like cultural competency of judges and prosecutors and like defense attorneys and all of those types of things, because like once those people understand like once the judges and the lawyers, they understand like the people that they're supposed to be representing and convicting and stuff like that, then there probably will be changes in like the way people are sentenced and stuff, because like they'll take into account all the factors of maybe like why things happen and about like social supports and like if they have like resources and stuff. So I think that it's just like, are the prosecutors like aware of the people that they are like trying to put the charges on and stuff like that? So
I think for them, there's just incentives that aren't necessarily the like welfare of the defendants, and they're like working in their job and their capacity to like charge people, make arrests. And I'm not like saying that's not like their job, that they shouldn't be doing, but I think the client necessarily isn't their focus for the prosecutor, or their own client's their focus, but not necessarily like the defendant. Yeah, personally.
But a great deal of uniqueness in DC, right? I was walking through Northeast last week, and there were all these signs on telephone poles of training about observing, monitoring police behavior. You know, where other place do you see that? Like a training that was given last weekend, I think, about really trying to watch law enforcement and their behavior in the communities, the over-policing that you alluded to. It is a unique dynamic here. So.